All right, everyone. Hi, welcome to Accessibility Talks. Accessibility Talks is a monthly virtual meetup where we come together to discuss topics around all things website accessibility. Today, I'm your host, Carie Fisher, but I'm also part of the panel. Today, it's a little bit of a shakeup. If you have any questions for our speaker, you can put them in the chat window as always, or if you're on Twitter, you can tag them there with A11yTalks, spelled A11yTalks. This month, we're happy to have three speakers representing their DrupalCon Nashville session. Helena McCabe, who is a front-end developer and accessibility specialist at Lullabot. Catharine McNally, who is a product manager and accessibility specialist at Phase 2. And me, I'm Carie Fisher. I work at Hook42 as a front-end developer and also an accessibility specialist. Missing from the panel today is Mike Gifford from Open Concept, who had a conflict in scheduling, but he is here in spirit. So welcome all.
All right, so kicking us off, I wanted to take a second and talk about what accessibility is and why Drupal needs it. I'm guessing if you're tuned in, you probably already know a lot of this, so bear with me because it is important to cover it for the people who are maybe new. But at the heart of it, web accessibility is pretty simple. It's about building websites with the necessary accommodations so that people with disabilities can use them easily. I explained it to a client once. Web accessibility is like the wheelchair ramp at a store, but for websites. So it's not a frill, it's a quality issue, and it's especially important to our Drupal community. So as we go over the high-level overview on the accessibility basics, I'm going to explain why that is. And now we can flip it, yeah. So when we talk about who benefits from web accessibility, we have a few different groups of people who primarily benefit. And that's the visually impaired, blind people, or people who can't see well. They might have trouble just distinguishing between colors. Color blindness is really common in men. Viewing content without enough contrast, especially the elderly, or you might have people who aren't able to see at all. We also have the deaf and hard of hearing community, and they may have trouble understanding content that's poorly captioned or isn't captioned at all. And it's really beneficial to have a chat option instead of having to call if you have like a helpline on your website. We also have people who are motor impaired. So those are people who have fine or gross motor problems. So that could be something like a tremor from Parkinson's, or that could be as severe as being paralyzed from the neck down. I mean, anything that makes it difficult to use a mouse. We also have people with vestibular issues and seizures, and these issues are extremely important and they're often overlooked. These are one of the most direct ways that a poorly built website can physically harm our users rather than just being inconvenient. So it's really important to be mindful of these. I know parallax was all the rage a few years ago and that a lot of companies and designers are still really fond of it. But people with vestibular issues can get motion sickness from those types of effects. So it's good to be really sparing and gentle with them if we use them at all. And of course, websites with bright flashing effects can trigger seizures in some people. So no matter how important or exciting that blog post is, please don't use flashing effects to pull someone's attention toward it. And finally, we have cognitive disabilities. That's a very varied group. That's our aging population with Alzheimer's and different forms of dementia who still want to retain some independence. We have people with conditions like Down syndrome and autism that are working and applying for jobs, so that's important. And supporting these communities by helping them be as self-sufficient as possible is an important goal. So there are some ways that people with disabilities use the web a little differently. With keyboard and screen reader accessibility, that is great. Most blind people and people with motor disabilities don't use a mouse because if you can't see your cursor, you don't know what you're clicking. And so they often navigate the site by keyboard. That means nothing on your website should require a mouse to interact with. And this is one of your biggest accessibility wins. If you're like, how can we make accessibility a little bit better? It covers a lot of diverse disabilities, and it's really heavily needed by so many people. So usually when blind people are keyboard navigating, they're also using a screen reader. So that means we'll want to be sure that we're being mindful about what will and won't be read when someone's navigating our websites, like providing descriptive text about destination of links instead of just an image or the words click here, and using appropriate alternative text on images to describe them. So it's important not to co-opt those accommodation tools for like black hat SEO keyword stuffing. So I know every now and then your SEO guy might say like, hey, jam a lot of keywords in the alt text because it's good for SEO, but please don't do that. That's like putting a big advertisement sign that like sits on the ground on your wheelchair ramp. Yeah, you're advertising more, but no one can wheel up your ramp. So let's paint the sign onto the ramp if we need to use that for a sign. Deaf people need captions to know what's going on in videos with speech, especially when the speech is a narration of imagery. So transcripts and captions aren't the same thing. They serve different purposes. Captions happen in time with the audio and video. They're primarily for deaf people, although they also benefit people with sensory processing difficulties that make it hard to translate the sound of speech into words quickly enough to follow along. So they may prefer to read the dialogue as well to help them process those words faster. And transcripts are a full transcription of both the audio and visual information provided by a video. So these are particularly useful for your deafblind users because they're going to usually translate that information into a Braille reader and then get the full rundown of what that video contained. Color and contrast is really important for low vision users, especially the elderly. Contrast can really be key. I know that light gray text on white backgrounds and these razor thin, hair thin fonts, they're so subtle and stylish and popular, but they're really awful for people with low vision. To hit AA compliance, which is where we at least want to be, the standard is a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 for normal text and 3 to 1 for large text, which is anything above 18 pixels. Although REMs are better, but I digress. For colorblind users, messages like select the green button or the data on this topic is shown in blue on this chart. That can be really unclear if you're colorblind. So it's best to stay away from relying solely on color to convey information. And then for people with cognitive differences, we often think of accessibility in terms of like physical accommodations, but cognitive accommodations are equally important. Perhaps, we might even have more people with cognitive disabilities. So people with dementia and Alzheimer's, they're going to benefit from websites with a predictable, constant, intuitive layout. So they don't have to constantly reorient themselves to use the website. I mean, things should kind of be where they would expect them to be from page to page. And people with intellectual disabilities or sensory processing issues like dyslexia might need a little more time to digest your content, especially if it's complex. So use the clearest language possible and don't force users through content at a pace beyond their control. So hey, auto advancing homepage slider with text. Skipping features like that is really helpful for these communities. So our need for accessibility in the Drupal community comes from three main sources. We have our Drupal users, and these are our end users who will use our websites. And this is the group that we most frequently think of when we talk about accessibility, but it doesn't end there. We also have our Drupal developers with disabilities. I know blind developers who love Drupal 8 because of how easy it is for them to use it. So people with disabilities aren't just consumers of content, they're creating it too. An inclusive Drupal community needs to be built to include everyone who wants to use these tools, not just the easiest bodies for us to build for. And Drupal clients, the businesses and agencies that Drupal developers build websites for. Next, yeah. One of the most pervasive excuses for skipping over accessibility on web projects is that it's an edge case. And this really has to stop because it's not. I've heard so many times that there's no budget for it on the project, even when it's originally contracted for, because there were other features that the client wanted. So we dropped accessibility because it was deprioritized as an edge case. And in every instance that this has happened, IE testing and support has stayed on the roster. And now I'm not saying we should drop IE support, but to put it into perspective, we've got somewhere between 12.6% of all people in the US having a disability and somewhere between 3 and 8% of all people using IE. So it kind of begs the question of why is it that we as an industry are fascinated with accounting for a browser that very few people are using, but we're routinely ignoring or deprioritizing accessibility. At 12, and here's just a few other things and how they stack up so we can see how much of a thing this really is. At 12.6% of the 2016 population, that brings us to an estimated 40.7 million people in the US with a disability. That's about 1 million more people than the entire population of California. And we can see how it stacks up. I mean, like, look at Tennessee. It's like 6 times the portion of Tennessee. So if you told your client, like, yeah, the website works, but it won't work in Tennessee, they would never let you launch it. But it's so much more of an issue for accessibility than people think. So our clients need accessibility, you know, even if they don't always know they do or they haven't heard of it, both, you know, to cover for them their access to customers. I mean, missing 12.6% of the market is a financial travesty for any business. That's a really big deal. And then there's also legal safety, because being sued is bad. And there's these 3 main topics that we get into a lot with clients. There's Section 508, and that's a government requirement that says any public government website, anything that takes any federal funding. So, you know, if your private university takes a $1,000 grant from the government, you fall under Section 508. It's really important to hold up that standard. And then there's the WCAG 2.0, and that's where we get the POUR acronym. That's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And that gives us the like why reasons for conformance. It's what we should really be shooting for. And then we have Title III of the ADA. This is a new development, but last year, digital spaces became the legal responsibility for most organizations to provide accommodation, just like physical spaces. And that's a really, really big deal. Not too long ago, we would tell our clients, oh, you know, unless you're publicly funded, you don't have a legal requirement. You just have like a moral obligation and a business obligation. But without that legal punch, people didn't really care that much. But, you know, companies like Netflix and H&R Block and Blue Apron are being sued for discrimination against people with disabilities now. And last year, Florida's federal court ruled that Winn-Dixie's website being inaccessible violated the ADA. So that's on some legal precedent like never before, that private companies are subject to the ADA compliance. And that's pretty exciting. So why Drupal needs accessibility? I feel like that's such a simple question. It's because Drupal's for everyone. The bottom line is that Drupal's a really big deal. We're estimated at a market share of about 2.2% of all websites. And that's not a big percentage, but the web is really big. When you consider how many websites actually exist, 2.2% is pretty massive. The work we're doing here matters a lot. And, you know, agencies may not always know how, or they may not make time for accessibility. So the better Drupal core is right out of the box, the better accessibility is going to be for everyone. So now that I've talked your ear off and given you a high-level overview of what accessibility is and why we're doing it, especially here in Drupal, I'm going to pass it off to Catherine, who will tell us about what we've done recently to make things better.
Thank you. I hope I'm not muted. I have a feeling I am. Can you confirm for me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, no, I'll take it. Oh, you can't speak. Okay, lovely. So, I'm excited to be talking to you guys. Just to give you a little bit of a background, I lost my hearing to meningitis when I'm 8 months old. So if you have questions, I may not be able to catch it all. So I appreciate the group chat. But I've always been an advocate for technology and integrating it into our mainstream. And so I'm really passionate about making sure that businesses and organizations have technology that bridges the digital divide. And so I'm going to kind of go over some recent Drupal core accessibility improvements that make it easier for Drupal to be a leader in accessible content management systems and to create better experiences for everybody. I'm going to go over some Drupal 8 wins as of late. The inline form errors is now stable. So what that means is we can now use it reliably. When there's an error, it used to be a message at the top of the screen. And a screen reader, user may not necessarily know that there is an error until it received focus. Now, with this improvement, the user of a screen reader is immediately made aware after form submit of an error. So there's no longer any confusion about why they haven't advanced through a form when they didn't realize it was an error. So that's nice. And I think I just talked about Drupal announce on that, by the way. So inline form errors not only take you directly to the form with the error, which is nice because it doesn't just say first name is required field. It will actually take you to the first name is required field. And so that actually allows for you to not only know the error, but see the form. And then we've got the Umami out of the box, the theme demo complete with accessibility features. And it's really a great way to demonstrate accessibility that's already in place. So they can kind of like plug and play. You can see how certain accessibility patterns are being used and like alt text and that kind of thing. So that's a pretty nice thing. And then we've got point release processes because there's a lot of continuous innovation and development. We don't have to wait for a whole version update to see some accessibility improvements. We can start utilizing this for more iterative improvements. I'm gonna go over this video demo of Drupal announce so that you can hear what it sounds like and how it can be helpful for a user of a screen reader.
You are currently on a button. To click this button, press Control Option Space. Press search button. Search vertical line 11y2. Error message. Please enter some keywords.
So the user was immediately made aware of the error. So that's a pretty nice thing. And that's something so simple, but really helps for users who cannot see the screen. All right, and then we got why isn't Drupal announce already in Drupal core? So we need to find opportunities where Drupal announce can be used beyond just errors. Like, what are the options and how can we help the community understand these options? And so what are ways that we as a community can do to make sure that these models have Drupal announce using it when it's appropriate? And how can we help people know about it? Because it's such a great thing. So we need to start talking about this and helping people become more aware of the Drupal announce. Umami accessibility is a theme that is part of Drupal 8. It's not quite out yet. It's in beta release. And the Umami team is still working on documentation around it. But at a high level, the menu is accessible. And there's some primary tab theming updates. The heading structures are already accessible and have a good example and a good practice. And then the alt text have images already in place, which is another really helpful example and to show how this can be beneficial. I'm gonna show like a brief video of some of the good examples of accessibility in Umami.
Main navigation.
So there's an example of the landmarks already being a part of this, which is another great thing.
Search. User account menu navigation. Main. Content info.
Landmarks are great because a lot of users just jump around to different parts of the page and different parts of the site. And that way, they don't have to go through the whole nav menu or go through the whole main to get to a certain part. So they're just nice.
Main. User account search. Main navigation. You are currently in a navigation. Heading level 2. Main navigation. List 3 items. Visited. Link. Home. 1 of 3. Link. Articles. 2 of 3. You are currently on a link. Visited. Link. Recipes. 3 of 3.
So the nice thing about this, it's already structured in a way that helps users understand the depth of the menu. 1 of 3. 2 of 3. They can really clearly understand where the current keyword focus is.
You press visited recipes vertical line 11y on any demo web content. You are currently on web content. Landmarks menu. Banner main nav search. Use breadcrumb main group. You are current link difficulty medium. You're heading level 2 link deep Mediterranean quiche. Your link view recipe. Visited link image.
So what I just described to you is one of the cart layouts, and one of the accessibility enhancements that we're looking to do is wrap the whole section in one link, instead of these repetitive links being repeated over and over again. So that's one of the things that we have in the backlog. There's a few color contrast ratio updates that are needed. Redundant link cleanups, like when I just showed you. In the error state messages, needs to be added color and icons. Like, you know, sometimes you may see a triangle with an exclamation mark for an error, something like that. And there's a few issues with Layout Builder. And so we need to be working on making more accessible to users who need support with the screen read or assistive technologies for using Layout Builder. Because we want to make Drupal something that somebody can do on the back end in the CMS. And I think I'm going to hand it off to Carie.
So what accessibility initiatives are we working on currently in Drupal 8? So this is a good point to note also that accessibility is a journey and not a destination. We will continue to work on accessibility issues in Drupal and other platforms, but we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that will ever be 100% accessible, since accessibility is essentially a moving target. You've got different and ever-changing accessibility standards, laws, browsers, assistive technology devices, and then of course all the users are different. But all that being said, here are some of the initiatives that are upcoming and ongoing that we're working on right now in Drupal. Next slide. Oh, sorry, there's also a quick notation for people new to Drupal in this presentation. So if there's a number in brackets, it actually means implying that Drupal.org node, and that's the node ID number. Okay, so one of the things that used to be in Drupal was some of this automated testing. We used to have automated testing in Drupal with Quail.js, but and that was very specific to Drupal, but it's no longer supported. And so at this point, we need to decide if we need to add in testing, if so, which testing systems that we want to add into Drupal core. And so again, there's ones that we're looking at specifically, Tenon, Pally, and others, to help with accessibility regressions, new bugs, etc. But we need to keep in mind that automatic testing of tools, of course, are only about 20 to 40% effective. And they can also produce false positive at times. So it's not a perfect system, but it's also a way to get some obvious bugs out of the core or any of the contrib modules that are added as well. But we're talking specifically about core today. So the hope is that some of these would be integrated into the code itself. And so then if a new feature is added or somebody updates something in core, it would throw a red flag like, hey, have you considered this? And I also feel like this automated testing into core itself would also lend itself to additional kind of accessibility testing, because it'll also be in people's minds, say, oh, hey, we're only catching 20 to 40% of the errors. Let's go beyond and test this further and deeper. Okay, next one. So another initiative that's being worked on right now in Drupal 8 is the layout builder. So this is an experimental module that was introduced actually in the most recent major release in 8.5. It was added without passing an accessibility review, but partially that's because there are no good accessible patterns for the drag and drop part of the system of the layout builder itself. So drag and drop is something that people use to visually change the layout of the page or the look of the page. So a content editor could do it, a themer could do it, in theory your clients could do it. And so it's something that needs to be very user-friendly and like a low bar when it comes to technology and code and that sort of thing. But again, there's no widely accepted drag and drop accessible patterns right now. So at this point, we need to evaluate this further and look at the patterns that are actually out there right now. And maybe we can make modifications to them, or maybe we want to take Drupal in a completely brand new direction, right? It's unclear who's quite responsible for fixing this type of foundational issue, but if we take the charge and we can fix them in Drupal, we could essentially be on the forefront of shaping the accessible web landscape. So that's good for us in Drupal, but it's also good for the larger accessibility community, because this is an issue that faces other modules or other initiatives that are out there as well. So if we could do it right and do it in Drupal well, we could be, you know, that much further ahead of the bar, so to speak, and kind of pushing the edge. So that's another initiative. So beyond that, we're looking at some pretty fundamental things outside of actual initiatives. So in here, we're talking about the WCAG 2.1s. They are coming up. In theory, they're going to be finalized in June. So the WCAG 2.0s, just for reference, are the global regulations and rules around website accessibility. And they were finalized and implemented back in 2008. So now the WCAG 2.1 guidelines are coming out just to help supplement and expand some of the older guidelines. For instance, there are some completely new guidelines for parts of the web that didn't exist back in 2008. Plus, we have some new considerations for things like plain language, cognitive disabilities, people with low vision, and also mobile accessibility. There's some really cool, exciting things that are happening there, and we're hoping that maybe in a further talk we can get into a little bit more of the 2.1s. But for now, let's just say there's some really cool, exciting things happening. We need to be prepared. We want to be proactive, not reactive in this case. The same thing with the Y ARIA 1.1 best practices. Those have been out already for a while, and minor changes happen, but there's a lot we can still do with that. Migrate specifically, this is a kind of a cool one. I like this idea. So what this is when you migrate from like Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, in theory, Drupal 8 to Drupal 9, we want to have a system in place or integrated into the migrate system already that integrating accessibility into the migrate system. So when you're doing this kind of migration, it could also tag and flag things like, hey, you're missing alt text, you have dead links, you can swap in this HTML5 element to the markup, etc. Again, this is not going to make the site 100% accessible, but it's definitely like an add-on feature for accessibility that would result in cleaner and more accessible code. So it's really kind of a cool idea. So the media initiative did address some of the things, the A tag and some other issues, but we could even improve it a little bit more. So very similar to the migrate system, where you think about integrating accessibility best practices into the media module. So clients could save time, they could save money, users would get a more robust and accessible experience if we, from the very beginning, when videos are uploaded or images are uploaded, the accessibility best practices are in there as well. So maybe you have an additional field for video transcripts or caption, alt tags, or, you know, text is already in core, but it's not required. So maybe we could push it up like one more here on this medium initiative as well. So there's a lot of cool things that could happen there. Oh, sorry, going back one more there. So last but not least, is Umami. And Catherine talked a little bit about Umami and showed a little bit of demo. But Umami technically is in the latest release of Drupal core, but it's kind of partially hidden. And that's just because people are still doing some really great work on it. And so now, right before the release, it's supposed to release in the fall with the 8.6 version. So between now and the fall, we actually have this kind of grace period to kind of get in there and do a little bit more with accessibility and really kind of dig in there. And this is a great place where if you maybe aren't familiar with code, or you're not comfortable working on that sort of level of technical detail, there's also places where you can get involved when it comes to like content creation, alt text for images, just making sure, you know, color contrast ratios. There's a lot of like easy wins for accessibility that have been evaluated at one point, but as things progress and more content is added and the demo matures, I imagine that there'll be additional tickets and considerations for that as well. Okay, next slide. So along those lines as well is like those are very, specific to initiatives, core things, very big, core things. But besides that, you have these supporting strategic initiatives. So these are things that aren't necessarily in core yet, but will actually, apply to core. So things like theme component library. So again, building best practices, accessibility best practices into those components, which would in theory get into core at some point. Same thing with the JavaScript modernization, error messages. That's one that we are always talking about, it seems like, but there's additional JavaScript things to do if that's where you seem to lie. Experimental admin UI. So again, more JavaScript fun things. Outside in, so again, this is more about testing and using the tools that are available in the world and then bringing that into the normal workflow of core and Drupal in general. I'm going to hand this off to Helena if she wants to unmute.
Nah, that's okay. I'll do it mute and let you guys guess. No. So we're going to go over how the community can help improve accessibility in Drupal. Let's see. So we do have some really specific challenges when we talk about accessibility in Drupal. And one is that there's just not enough accessibility understanding or expertise to go around. I mean, accessibility specialists are kind of few and far between. I mean, I think everyone in this room that specializes in accessibility knows that we're kind of a small pond and we all have limited time. And on top of that, automatic accessibility testing only catches around 20 to 40% of the issues. I know it looks like a really attractive thing to say, well, we'll just automate it. And there's so much about accessibility that's conceptual that it's really difficult to build a tool to do all of it because it's not a human. It can't tell if that alt text is good or not. It can only tell if it's present. So we really do need, real people testing these things. On top of that, manual accessibility testing is time consuming. It can be difficult. And, those of us who don't have a disability will never be as good at testing accessibility as people who do, because we just don't use those tools the same way. It's on a totally different level. And asking, the population of the Drupal community to bear that entire weight is a very big ask. And accessibility is a moving target between changing accessibility standards, laws, browsers, assistive technology devices, and users. Making it perfect for everyone is a very big challenge. I don't think we'll ever hit perfect for everyone, but we're striving for good for everyone. And hopefully we'll get there. There are some low-hanging fruit that I think more people could get involved with, like checking the markup structure, ARIA roles, styling, theming, things like that like everyone can do with just a base level of knowledge of accessibility. Where we've got some more difficult topics where if you are more advanced, you're heavily needed there. And that's things like creating new widgets, doing the screen reader testing, checking for motion sickness, keyboard navigation, and documentation. Even if you're not a coder, just documentation is such a big help. And we have the why should you help? Organizations, it does benefit you to help, even if that seems like an outlay. Just increasing and diversifying the user base for Drupal, getting more people to use Drupal, supporting your employees with disabilities, and not getting sued, complying with the law, and saving time and money are all big incentives. For agencies, that's also a great thing to do because you're going to attract great employees, especially people with disabilities, people who are interested in diversity and want to see that happen. That's a great thing for an agency to do. It also helps us sell Drupal to clients because we do hear a lot of like, well, will the site be accessible and how much of a line item is that for me? If we're making that investment in bettering Drupal, it really is an investment that will pay dividends. It helps us foster inclusivity and give back to open source. So providing your employees time on the clock to work on the Drupal project, especially improving accessibility, is a great thing to do. As for the community, that's, if you're just a developer and you want to dive in on your own time, that's valuable for you too. It's not just charity work. It's somewhat selfish because you're honing your skills. The more you know about accessibility, the more you know about best practices in general. So you're becoming a better developer. It helps you think about development in new ways that you might not have considered, improving your online empathy. You'll find a great community. You'll hang out with cool people like us. So there's always that. And it's a good way to give back and help Drupal stay relevant. And in management, you should really want to help because leadership is in a special place to increase diversity, to grow involvement, improve software. I mean, you're really holding a lot of the cards in leadership. So if you can do that, please do that. That's a really great place to be. And how can you help? Now you're like, okay, you've convinced me, but what do I do? For organizations, increase your accessibility expertise. Allow people to contribute, provide those resources, and definitely sponsor events like DrupalCon and local Drupal camps, especially. The more funding we have to do things like that, the more we can do things like that. Again, for agencies, please give your employees time on the clock to work on these things. Make it, for your salespeople, work it into the client contract and the budget so that we know it's happening. And let people contribute the work that they do on client time back. Whenever you can negotiate that with a client, that's a really wonderful thing to do. Provide those resources. For the community, educate yourself, read up on accessibility. Come to things like this and come listen and learn, and talk to people with disabilities especially and get their perspective. Just be present whenever you can. And for leadership, find a mentee, someone who you can take under your wing and teach what you know. Write blogs, give webinars, anytime you can share that information or encourage, your team to. That's a really wonderful thing to do. And how can you contribute and connect? If you want to add code, Drupal.org really needs you. We've got a lot of accessibility tickets, some easy, some tough, but we could really use you. There's a lot of other open source projects. There's GitHub projects. I mean, please dive in on that stuff. Umami could really use some help. If you have JavaScript skills, you are especially needed. With documentation, documentation's great. You're not a coder, but you want to help. Documentation's awesome. Mike Gifford, Andrew McPherson, and Carie all have access to the Drupal.org accessibility pages now. So if you want to dive in on and help, reach out to one of them or, ping them and write something up. There's a lot of local meetups. There's virtual meetups like this one, accessibility talks. Attend those. Come be part of it. And we have connections in your network. There's a lot of different ways to get involved. There's the W3C Slack. There's Twitter, which you're probably already on, I would hope. But try to reach outside of your network if you're US based, because we're pretty behind when it comes to Canada and Europe. So, reach out beyond your borders, maybe reach out beyond who you usually know, talk to people with disabilities, and keep the conversation going. Make friends and build awesome stuff together so we can make the web awesome for everyone.
Cool. And there's a link to resources. We can post those on the YouTube channel once that's complete. But at this point, yeah, I think we can open up to any questions. We have a few minutes left. If anyone has any. I haven't seen any so far. I think we've just covered everything and there are no questions, possibly. People are quiet today. But yeah, no, if you do have any questions too, we'll post the Catharine and Helena and my Twitter handles and Mike Gifford's as well. You can find us in the Slack chat rooms as well too for accessibility. So there's different ways to reach us, obviously. So if you do have any questions later, you just didn't want to post them in the chat window for whatever reason, that's cool too. But yeah. So it's been, yeah, it was very exciting. Yeah, we had a good time presenting this, I think, in Nashville, and had a lot of good questions from the audience that hopefully we addressed later. But if there's additional ones, let us know. But yeah, unless you guys have any last minute thoughts, questions, statements. appreciate your guys' time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.